He went into the jungle in search of treasure, but what he found underground was better left undisturbed. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city you're watching us from. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and smoke from small cooking fires that barely clung to life in the parched soil of the village. For months, the rains had refused to come, and what had once been fields of green was now little more than cracked ground littered with withered stalks. In the midst of this hardship lived Eli Johnson, a man of 40 years whose skin was dark as the soil he worked, and whose hands bore the calluses of a lifetime spent struggling against the weight of poverty. His hair was beginning to show strands of gray, not from age alone, but from the burden of responsibility that pressed on him daily. Eli came from a line of people who had never known ease. His grandfather used to speak of the years when men in uniforms, pale-skinned and commanding, pushed villagers into forced labor, making them carry stones and timber deep into the jungle. His father had spent most of his life in the mines, lungs blackened by dust, body bent from endless toil. Eli himself had tried to escape that fate by staying close to the village, cultivating what land he could. But now, with the drought stealing away what little they had, he felt trapped in the same cycle of despair. His wife and children looked at him with weary eyes, waiting for him to provide, to find a way out of hunger and thirst. It was the thirst that finally drove him into the jungle. The river that had once sustained the village had dried to a trickle, leaving behind only stagnant pools that reeked of rot. Eli had grown desperate, and desperation breeds courage, or perhaps madness. He gathered a simple iron spade, a small jug of water, and a battered lantern, and told no one where he was going. To the others he muttered only that he would look for a solution, that perhaps in the old riverbed there still ran veins of underground water. In truth, he carried with him not just hope, but a gnawing memory, the kind that claws its way into the mind when everything else is stripped away. That memory was of his grandfather's stories, whispered by firelight when Eli was a boy. Tales of men in black coats and strange helmets who marched into the jungle during the Great War far away, leaving behind trails of machinery, crates, and sometimes screams that echoed at night. The old man spoke of nights when the air itself seemed to tremble, when lights glowed deep between the trees and vanished by dawn. He had warned that the jungle kept its secrets close and that not all of them were meant to be disturbed. Eli had never believed the stories, dismissing them as the ramblings of an elder who had seen too much suffering and wrapped it in myth. But now, digging into the dry bed of the river, he could not shake those words from his head. The jungle around him was alive in ways that the village was not. Cicadas shrieked in the heat, monkeys leapt from branch to branch, and somewhere in the undergrowth a jaguar padded silently, its golden eyes glimmering. The canopy overhead allowed only narrow shafts of sunlight to pierce through, painting the earth in shifting patterns. Every step into the thicket felt like a step into another world, a world older than men, where roots coiled like snakes and vines hung like curtains concealing doorways to unknown realms. Eli felt small under its weight, but he also felt driven. Each swing of his spade into the soil was not just labor, it was defiance against despair. For hours he worked, the sweat soaking his shirt, his muscles screaming in protest. The earth was stubborn, packed tight from years of drought, but Eli was more stubborn. He remembered his children's faces, the hollow cheeks of his neighbors, and he drove the spade down again and again, until, with a dull clang, the blade struck something that was not stone. The sound startled him, ringing out unnaturally in the muffled hush of the jungle. He froze, heart hammering, listening for the echo. It came again when he tapped gently with the spade. A metallic resonance, faint but undeniable. At first, he thought it must be some kind of scrap left from logging companies or perhaps old mining equipment discarded and forgotten. Yet, as he brushed away the soil with his calloused hands, he uncovered edges too precise to be chance. Beneath the roots and dirt lay what appeared to be a flat surface, iron or steel, wide enough that it stretched beyond the limits of his shallow pit. His pulse quickened. The metal was mottled with rust, but there were markings on it, faint grooves that seemed too straight, too deliberate. He sat back on his heels, wiping sweat from his brow, and felt the chill of something ancient stirring within him. His grandfather's stories rose up again like specters, words about doors in the earth and men who dug where they had no right to dig. Eli shook his head, scolding himself for giving in to old fears. And yet, he could not deny that what he had found was no ordinary stone or discarded tool. It was a surface, perhaps even a door. Night began to fall quickly, as it always did in the jungle. The calls of birds turned to the cries of nocturnal hunters, and the shadows deepened into a thick darkness. Eli lit his lantern, its glow flickering against the leaves, and gazed once more at the metal in the earth. He told himself he'd come to find water, but he could not tear his eyes away from the strange surface. He felt as though he had pulled at a thread of something vast, and the whole fabric of the world might unravel if he continued. Still, he also felt the pull of purpose, a sense that this discovery was bound to him, that he had been led here not by chance, but by the weight of generations pressing on his shoulders. He decided to return to the village for the night, concealing his work with branches and soil, but his sleep was restless. In his dreams he saw images that made no sense, walls of concrete buried beneath the earth, the echo of foreign voices, the cries of men and women in pain. He awoke before dawn, drenched in sweat, the echo of the metallic clang still reverberating in his ears. The next morning, before the village had stirred, Eli returned to the site. He carried more water, more tools, and a determination that bordered on obsession. He dug with renewed ferocity, stripping away layers of earth, roots, and stone until more of the surface revealed itself. It was indeed a man-made structure, rectangular, with seams that suggested it could be opened. As he worked, he noticed faint letters etched into the metal, worn by time but still legible. They were not in English, nor in any language he knew, but their angular precision and strange characters sent a shiver down his spine. He did not understand them, but they looked like they belonged to another world, another time. By midday he had uncovered nearly half the surface. His body ached, his hands were blistered, yet he felt a fire inside him that drowned out the pain. The jungle seemed to hold its breath, the usual chatter of animals eerily subdued. Eli paused, listening to the silence, and for the first time he wondered if he should stop. But the thought of turning back now felt impossible. He had unearthed something far greater than water. He had found a door, and doors existed to be opened. As the sun dipped low and the first hints of evening painted the sky crimson, Eli stood over the strange metal plate, lantern at his side, and whispered to himself words he had never thought he would speak. Grandfather was right. It was no longer about water or survival. It was about truth, buried deep in the soil, waiting for him to uncover it. And though fear coiled tightly in his gut, Eli knew with certainty that he would return tomorrow and the day after, until the door yielded to him. The jungle had given him a secret, and secrets demanded to be revealed. The following morning broke with a heavy mist clinging to the trees, the kind of damp haze that wrapped itself around every branch and vine as if to conceal what lay hidden in the forest. Eli was already awake long before the sun rose, his body weary from the strain of the previous day, but his mind restless with determination. The metallic surface he had uncovered had refused to leave his thoughts. Even in sleep, he had seen its dull gleam beneath the soil, and he had heard the echo of his spade striking it, over and over again, like a drumbeat calling him back. His children had asked where he was going so early, but he only told them he had work to do, work that might save them all. He could not tell them the truth, not yet. How could he explain that he was chasing a memory, chasing a ghost his grandfather had whispered about by firelight decades before? When he returned to the pit, the jungle seemed quieter than usual. The cries of birds were distant, as if muffled by the fog, and the insects that usually filled the air with their endless hum were strangely subdued. He brushed away the branches and leaves he had used to conceal the sight, revealing the iron plate beneath. It looked even larger in the pale morning light, the edges sharp against the earth, a shape too precise to be natural. He crouched beside it, running his fingers across the rusted surface. Beneath the grime of years, the markings were clearer now. Not words he understood, but characters carved with an engineer's hand, symbols that did not belong to his land, nor to his people. His grandfather's warnings rang again in his head, about men in black uniforms who had marched into the forest during the war, about the lights that had flickered among the trees and the voices that spoke a harsh, foreign tongue. As a boy, Eli had thought these were only tales meant to frighten children into staying close to home. But now, touching this cold iron buried deep in the jungle's embrace, he realized that there had been truth in those words. Something had been left behind, something deliberately hidden. He felt a shiver of both fear and awe. He set to work with renewed urgency, using his spade and bare hands to peel away the layers of soil that still clung to the plate. Every stroke revealed more of its shape until he uncovered what appeared to be a seam running across the center. The edge of a hatch, perhaps, or a door. His pulse quickened. He struck the seam lightly with the handle of his spade, and the sound echoed hollow beneath the ground, confirming his suspicion that there was space below. This was not merely a piece of discarded machinery. It was an entrance. The thought both thrilled and terrified him. What kind of men had built such a thing so deep in the wilderness, and for what purpose? He remembered how his grandfather had spoken of people disappearing into the jungle, never to return, and he wondered if this was where they had been taken. The idea filled him with dread, yet it also steeled his resolve. He was no longer just searching for water. He was digging into history itself, unearthing what others had tried to bury forever. Hours passed as he chipped away at the stubborn rust that sealed the hatch. His hands grew blistered and raw, his muscles trembled with exhaustion, but still he pressed on. At times he thought he heard faint sounds from within, as if the hollow space beneath the plate was whispering back at him. Perhaps it was only his imagination, the echo of his own hammering, but it unsettled him all the same. By midday he had managed to loosen a corner enough to wedge the spade beneath it and test its weight. The metal resisted him, creaking like an ancient beast disturbed from slumber. He pushed harder, sweat streaming down his face, until finally, with a groan, the hatch shifted. A rush of air spilled out, stale and cold, carrying with it the smell of rust, oil, and something older, something that made his stomach tighten. It was the scent of time itself, of years sealed away in darkness. Eli staggered back, gripping his spade like a weapon, half expecting some creature to emerge from the hole. But nothing came, only silence. He leaned over cautiously, lantern in hand, and peered inside. A shaft descended into blackness, with rusted rungs bolted into the concrete wall. His lantern light was swallowed quickly, the beam vanishing into the abyss below. His first instinct was to close the hatch again and walk away, to bury it beneath earth and memory and pretend he had never found it. But he knew he could not. The discovery had already taken hold of him, rooting itself in his mind. To leave now would be to abandon not only the chance of salvation for his village, but the truth that his grandfather had carried to his grave. He felt the weight of generations pressing upon him, voices of those who had labored and suffered urging him onward. Still, fear gnawed at him. He sat at the edge of the pit for a long while, staring into the black hole, torn between dread and determination. His thoughts drifted to his family, to his children who waited for him to bring back water or food. He wondered what they would think if they knew he was about to descend into the very heart of the earth, chasing shadows left behind by men who had come and gone before his time. Would they call him foolish, or would they see in him the courage of a man who dared to face what others would not? As the sun dipped lower in the sky, painting the fog with streaks of red and gold, Eli made his choice. He tied his lantern to a rope, lowered it into the shaft, and watched the light swing gently, illuminating the slick concrete walls. Then, with a deep breath, he gripped the rungs and lowered himself down. The metal was cold beneath his hands, and flakes of rust clung to his palms as he descended slowly, each step echoing hollowly in the silence. The air grew colder the deeper he went, thick with the scent of decay and forgotten machines. At last his feet touched solid ground. He raised the lantern, and its glow revealed a corridor stretching ahead, narrow and lined with concrete. Rusted pipes ran along the ceiling, dripping with condensation, and the floor was littered with debris, broken crates, scraps of fabric, and fragments of machinery. Eli's heart pounded as he stepped forward, the echoes of his footsteps bouncing off the walls. The silence of the jungle above had been replaced by a different kind of silence, heavier and more suffocating, as if the air itself carried the weight of secrets too dark to speak. He realized then that he was standing at the threshold of something vast. This was no simple bunker or storehouse. This was a place built with purpose, hidden with intent. The deeper he went, the more he felt the eyes of the past upon him, watching from the shadows. The seam of the hatch above seemed impossibly far away now, a fragile link to the world he knew. Ahead lay only darkness, mystery, and the echo of his grandfather's voice warning him that some doors should remain closed. But Eli could no longer turn back. He had opened the trail into the underground, and now he was bound to follow it wherever it might lead. The air was thicker here, underground, as if every breath carried with it the weight of years sealed in concrete. Eli held his lantern high, its trembling light painting shifting shadows along the walls. The corridor stretched ahead, narrow and unwelcoming, the silence broken only by the drip of water somewhere in the distance. He forced himself to move slowly, carefully placing each step so that his boots would not echo too loudly, though the emptiness magnified even the smallest sound. Behind him, the shaft he had descended was little more than a pale circle of faint daylight, a reminder of the world above that already seemed impossibly far away. As he advanced, his lantern revealed the signs of what this place once had been. Rusted pipes hung like broken veins along the ceiling, their joints crusted with reddish flakes. The floor bore the stains of oil and time, dark streaks that no rain had ever washed away. On the left wall, he found a series of faded markings, letters painted in black that had long since blurred, though he could make out sharp, angular lines that looked nothing like his language. His grandfather's stories stirred in his memory again. Men speaking in harsh syllables, barking orders in words that cut through the air like knives. Now, here in the dark, those tales felt less like fables and more like echoes preserved in stone. He pressed forward, curiosity guiding him more than courage, until the corridor widened into a chamber. Here, the remnants of life, or death, awaited him. His lantern fell upon a stack of crates, splintered and rotting, their lids broken open. Inside lay scraps of machinery, twisted coils of copper wire, fragments of glass tubes. The sight was bewildering. These were not tools for farming or building, not the remnants of explorers or miners. These were instruments of another world, another purpose, one Eli could not fully understand. He touched a piece of metal, and it crumbled beneath his fingers like ash. It was then that he noticed the smell. Faint at first, sour and metallic, it grew stronger as he turned his lantern toward the far corner. His heart faltered at what the light revealed. A row of skeletal figures, their bones slumped against the wall, half buried beneath debris. Torn scraps of cloth clung to their frames, cloth once colored but now reduced to pale, rotting strands. Rusted shackles still clasped their ankles and wrists, fixing them to rings driven into the concrete. Eli's throat tightened, his chest heavy with horror. These were not soldiers who had chosen to be here. These had been prisoners. He stood frozen, unable to move as the reality of the place sank into him. His grandfather's words came back with cruel clarity. Men and women had been dragged into the jungle, forced into darkness, and left to die in silence. He thought of his own ancestors, their backs bent under the whips of masters, their lives treated as expendable. Could some of them have ended here, in this suffocating hole? Could their bones now rest against these cold walls, nameless and forgotten? A chill ran through him, and for a moment he considered fleeing, climbing back to the surface to leave this nightmare sealed away. But something in him refused to turn back. He had already disturbed the grave of the past. To leave now would be to betray those who had perished here, to abandon their story to dust and silence. Eli's lantern shook in his hand as he stepped closer. He noticed scratches on the walls, etched by desperate hands into the concrete. Some were nothing more than lines and gouges, but others formed symbols, letters carved with the last strength of dying prisoners. He could not read them, but their presence alone spoke of agony, of final attempts to be remembered. He reached out, pressing his fingertips gently against one mark, and for a moment it felt as if the stone itself still held the warmth of those who had suffered. He withdrew his hand quickly, trembling as though he had touched a ghost. He moved on through another passage, his breath shallow, ears straining for any sound beyond his own footsteps. The tunnels twisted and turned, a labyrinth of stone and shadow. At times he passed through narrow doorways into smaller rooms where remnants of machinery lay scattered. In one, he found what looked like a control station, its panels rusted, wires dangling like withered vines. Glass screens were shattered, their shards glittering faintly under the lantern's glow. He tried to imagine the men who had worked here, their faces lit by the eerie glow of machines, their hands pushing buttons, pulling levers, while unseen in the background others labored and died to sustain their work. The silence pressed harder on him until he began to hear things that might not have been there. Whispers, faint and fleeting, like breath brushing past his ear. He turned, sharply, lantern raised, but there was nothing. Only the endless corridors. Yet, when he pressed forward, the whispers seemed to follow, and with them came the sensation of being watched. His skin prickled, and sweat trickled down his spine. He told himself it was only his imagination, his mind inventing ghosts where there were none. But deep down, he wondered if the spirits of the dead lingered here, unwilling to rest while their torment remained buried. Eventually, the corridor narrowed again before opening into a vast hall, its ceiling arching high above, lost in darkness. Rows of rusting scaffolds lined the walls, and on the floor lay great cylindrical shells, each as long as a cart and twice as wide. He realized they were not shells at all, but the remains of weapons. Rockets, perhaps, like those he had once seen in old photographs from the war. The sight filled him with dread. These monsters had been built in secret, in silence, forged from the suffering of those who had died in the tunnels. He understood now that this place had not merely been a prison, but a factory, a womb of death where human misery had been transformed into machines of destruction. The scale of it overwhelmed him. He staggered back, lantern quivering, eyes darting across the vast space. The silence of the hall seemed heavier than before, as though the very walls carried the memory of screams. He felt the presence of the dead more strongly here, an invisible weight pressing on his shoulders, whispering that he was intruding upon ground consecrated by suffering. For a long time he stood, paralyzed between awe and horror, until finally he forced himself to breathe deeply and steady his shaking hands. He whispered aloud, his voice barely audible in the emptiness, "I see you. I will not forget." The words seemed to ease something within him, though the silence did not answer. Eli turned back toward the passage he had come from, but he knew he could not leave yet. The tunnels still stretched deeper into the earth, and with them the truth of what had happened here. Whatever these men had built, whatever they had hidden, it had cost countless lives. He could not rest until he had uncovered it. The jungle above had hidden this place for decades, but fate had led him here, and he would not betray it now. As he lifted his lantern once more and stepped into the next corridor, the whispers seemed to swell, guiding him forward into the heart of darkness. The tunnels of the dead had claimed him, and he knew with chilling certainty that the path ahead would reveal things even more terrible than what he had already seen. Eli pressed deeper into the underground labyrinth, his lantern swaying in his hand, casting long shadows that stretched like fingers clawing at the walls. The silence here was heavier than above, filled with the weight of unspoken stories and forgotten cries. Each step felt like trespassing into sacred ground, not because it was holy, but because it had been soaked in agony. The skeletal remains he had passed earlier clung to his mind, their empty sockets seeming to follow him, accusing him, demanding to be remembered. He could not erase the image of the shackles still locked around their brittle bones. They had died here, chained like animals, yet they had been human beings, men and women with names, families, and voices that had been silenced long ago. The tunnel narrowed, forcing him to crouch before opening again into a small chamber. The lantern light revealed a table, rotted through, its surface scattered with faded papers. Eli set the lantern down and carefully brushed the dust away. The papers crumbled at his touch, but some still held traces of words and diagrams. Though he could not read the foreign language written in harsh black ink, he could recognize numbers, measurements, sketches of strange devices. One drawing showed a tall cylinder, ringed with wires and pipes, something that looked both mechanical and otherworldly. His pulse quickened as he studied it, unease gnawing at him. Whatever these people had been building, it had not been for the good of mankind. Among the papers he found something else, a small notebook, its cover leather, the pages brittle but intact. The writing inside was dense, but what chilled him most were the stains, dark blotches that had seeped into the paper like dried blood. He could not read the words, but the drawings told enough, sketches of bodies, crude diagrams of organs, notes beside them. His stomach twisted. This had not been a place only for machines. It had been a place for experiments. The prisoners chained in the tunnels had not only been laborers, some had been subjects, sacrificed in the name of whatever dark science had taken root here. He closed the notebook with trembling hands and shoved it back onto the table, unable to look at it any longer. His breath came fast, echoing harshly in the chamber. He thought of his ancestors, dragged across oceans in chains, their bodies sold and broken, their lives treated as expendable. The men who had built this place had carried the same cruelty, the same disregard for human life. His people had not escaped it. They had carried it in their blood for generations. Perhaps even his own grandfather's warnings had come from knowledge of those taken into the jungle and never seen again. The thought hollowed him out. Eli staggered out of the chamber, gripping his lantern like a lifeline. The corridors wound endlessly, and in each new room he found more remnants of the past. Collapsed bunks lined one wall, the wood eaten by rot, the rusted frames twisted and broken. On the floor lay a scattering of bones, small and fragile, not of men, but of women or children. His chest constricted, fury rising within him. They had brought even the weakest here, sacrificed them to fuel their ambition. He could almost hear their cries echoing through the air, voices trapped in the stone. He whispered a prayer for them, though he had never been a man of faith, because to leave them without words felt like another cruelty. The deeper he went, the stronger his conviction grew. He was not here by accident. The jungle had chosen him, or perhaps the spirits of the dead had guided him to bear witness to what had been done. He could not allow the memory to remain buried. It was not only history, it was his history, the story of his bloodline. He carried their pain now, their suffering coursing through him, and he knew that whatever lay ahead would demand more of him than he had ever given. He entered another vast chamber, larger than the last, its ceiling high and lost in shadow. Here he found rows of work tables covered with the remains of equipment, broken glass cylinders, fragments of wires, rusted clamps still bolted into place. Some of the clamps were shaped in ways that made his skin crawl, clearly designed not for machines, but for restraining living bodies. On one table he saw a stain dark against the wood, a stain that time had not erased. He stepped back quickly, bile rising in his throat. The air seemed colder here, the silence heavier, as though the room itself remembered the screams of those who had been pinned down and cut open. He forced himself onward, lantern light quivering, until he reached the far side of the room. There, against the wall, was a series of tall cabinets, their metal doors rusted shut. He pried one open with effort, the screech of metal on metal shattering the silence. Inside were jars, dozens of them, their glass cloudy with age. Some still held murky liquid, and within the liquid, faint shapes that made him recoil, twisted fragments of flesh, organs preserved like trophies. His lantern light flashed across one jar that held what looked unmistakably like a small hand, its fingers curled as though frozen mid-plea. Eli dropped the lantern in shock, catching it only at the last moment before it shattered. His chest heaved, his vision blurred with tears. He slammed the cabinet shut, his entire body shaking with revulsion. Leaning against the wall, he pressed his eyes shut, but the images burned in his mind. He had thought he was prepared for horror, but nothing could have prepared him for this. These people had not simply enslaved others to build their weapons. They had desecrated them, turned their bodies into experiments, their suffering into data. Every bone in his body screamed that he should flee, leave this place sealed, let the dead rest. But another voice, quieter yet stronger, told him he must endure. Someone had to know. Someone had to carry the truth. He thought again of his family above, his children waiting for him. If he died down here, they would never know what had been uncovered, never know the history that lay beneath their feet. Yet, if he succeeded, if he brought this knowledge to light, perhaps the world would finally see the depth of the cruelty hidden in these jungles. Perhaps his people's pain would no longer be ignored. He clenched his fists, forcing his breathing to slow, and picked up his lantern again. The flame flickered but held steady, as though defying the darkness. Eli continued through the tunnels, his determination hardening with every step. The notebooks, the bones, the jars, they were all fragments of the same truth. This place was not just a factory. It was a graveyard, a laboratory of suffering, and a monument to the cruelty of men who had believed themselves above morality. His own ancestors had borne the weight of that cruelty, and now it was his turn to bear witness. As he stepped into yet another corridor, the air grew colder and the lantern's light seemed to falter. He sensed he was drawing closer to the heart of the underground, the place where the purpose of all this torment would reveal itself. Fear gnawed at him, but he pressed forward. He owed it to the dead, to his ancestors, to himself. Whatever lay ahead, he would face it. The legacy of pain was his inheritance, and now it was his burden to carry into the light. Eli moved on through the labyrinth, his lantern flickering as though the flame itself feared what lay ahead. The tunnels had carried him past bones, past cages of steel and glass, past horrors that spoke of men who had tried to break nature itself in their lust for power. Yet he knew, with an unshakable certainty, that the worst was still waiting. The air grew heavier the deeper he went, damp with a metallic tang that coated his tongue, and the floor beneath his boots seemed to slope downward, as though the earth itself was funneling him toward something vast and secret. He thought of the notebook he had left behind, its pages stained and filled with diagrams of human bodies treated like puzzles to be solved. He thought of the preserved hand floating in a jar, fingers curled forever in silent agony. Every step he took now was heavier, but he could not stop. He had been chosen to see this, or cursed to see it, and either way he knew there was no turning back. The passage suddenly opened into a cavernous hall, so immense that his lantern could not find its walls. He stopped, raising the light higher, squinting into the darkness. The ceiling stretched so high above him that it disappeared into shadow, and the walls curved away in silence, broken only by the faint drip of water echoing in the gloom. His heart quickened. He could feel the weight of the place pressing down upon him as though the earth itself trembled with what it concealed. He stepped forward, boots crunching on debris scattered across the floor, twisted metal beams, coils of wire, shattered glass. The smell here was stronger, a blend of rust, oil, and something acrid that stung his nose. Then, as he lifted the lantern higher, its light fell upon a shape that made his breath stop. In the center of the hall, looming in the half-light, stood an object unlike anything he had ever seen. It rose from the floor like a monument, its surface dull and metallic, covered with lines and ridges that formed patterns too precise to be random, yet too alien to be understood. The structure was massive, perhaps twice the height of a man, shaped like a bell. Its surface was scarred and pitted by time, but even in decay it radiated a sense of menace. Pipes ran into its base, broken now, and cables dangled from its sides like the veins of some long-dead creature. Eli's skin prickled, his stomach twisting as though his body recognized what his mind could not. This was the heart of it, the purpose for which all the tunnels, all the suffering, had been built. The bones in the walls, the chains on the floor, the jars of twisted flesh, every cruelty had been committed in service of this thing. He stepped closer, his lantern light washing over strange markings etched into the surface. They were not letters he knew, though some resembled symbols he had seen in old books from missionaries who had passed through the village long ago. The patterns spiraled across the bell's surface like veins of lightning frozen in metal. He reached out a trembling hand and touched the surface. It was cold, far colder than the damp air around it, and the instant his skin brushed the metal, a low hum vibrated through his bones. He staggered back, nearly dropping the lantern. The sound faded quickly, but the memory of it lingered in his chest, as though his heartbeat had synchronized with the pulse of the machine. He stared at it, fear surging through him. Had he imagined it? Or had the thing truly stirred, awakened by his touch after decades of silence? The chamber seemed to shift around him, the shadows lengthening, the air trembling. He thought of his grandfather's words, the tales of lights in the jungle, of men who sought to harness forces beyond comprehension. This was what they had meant. The bell, he could think of no other name for it, was not just a machine. It was an obsession, a curse forged in steel. Perhaps it had been meant as a weapon, perhaps as a tool to twist time or gravity itself. But whatever it was, it had been fed by death. He could almost hear the cries of the prisoners echoing in the hollow space, as if their suffering had seeped into the metal. At the base of the bell, he found remnants of consoles, their panels shattered, their dials rusted. He crouched and studied them, his lantern glinting off fragments of glass. Strange diagrams had been carved into the stone floor nearby, circles and lines intersecting like constellations. He imagined men in uniforms standing here, their faces lit by the glow of instruments, their voices sharp with command. He imagined prisoners being dragged into this chamber, forced to labor in the shadow of the machine, their blood staining the ground. Every vision sickened him, but he could not look away. On the far side of the chamber, he saw something that froze him where he stood. A wall, partially collapsed, revealed a row of bodies entombed in the rubble. They were not skeletons scattered at random like in the tunnels above. These had been sealed deliberately, buried upright against the stone as though the builders had tried to wall them away. Their mouths were open in silent screams, their hands raised as if to claw their way out. Eli felt bile rise in his throat. The machine had not only consumed their labor, it had claimed their lives as a part of its very construction. He turned from the sight, his eyes burning with tears. His lantern flickered, the flame bending as if caught by an unseen breath. He steadied it, but the flicker returned, rhythmic now, pulsing faintly in time with the hum he had felt from the bell. He realized with horror that the object was not dead. Somehow, after all these years, something inside it endured. It was faint, weak but alive in the way a coal still glows long after the fire has been smothered. Eli's pulse raced. He wanted to run, to flee the chamber, but his feet refused to move. He stood transfixed, caught between terror and awe. He thought of the men who had built this place, their ambition so great they had been willing to bury themselves in the earth and sacrifice countless lives for a dream. They had failed. The war above had ended, yet their creation still lingered, waiting. Eli's thoughts spiraled as he imagined what might happen if the bell were awakened again, if its power were unleashed. Would it tear open the sky? Would it drag the earth itself into ruin? Or would it bend time and space, reshaping reality according to the will of those who controlled it? The questions swarmed through his mind like insects, impossible to silence. At last, with an effort that shook his entire body, Eli tore his gaze away. He stumbled back toward the tunnel he had entered, his lantern clutched tightly, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Yet even as he turned away, he felt the bell's presence behind him, a weight pressing between his shoulder blades, a silent command to return. He knew he could not forget it. He could not pretend it was just a dream. The jungle had hidden it for decades, but now it had been found, and the secret was his to carry. He paused at the threshold of the tunnel, turning for one last glance. The bell stood in the darkness, motionless yet alive, its surface gleaming faintly as though it had caught the light of his lantern and held it. For a moment, Eli thought he saw the patterns on its surface shift, lines crawling like veins across its skin. He blinked, and they were still again. But the image lingered, burned into his mind. He whispered under his breath, words he barely understood, a vow or a curse. This must never wake. With that, he turned and vanished back into the tunnel, the sound of his footsteps swallowed by the silence of the chamber. The bell remained behind, humming faintly in the heart of the jungle, waiting. Eli's steps through the tunnel were unsteady, as though each stride carried not just his body, but the unbearable weight of what he had seen. The bell lingered in his thoughts with every breath, its presence clinging to him like a second shadow. Even as he put distance between himself and that vast chamber, he felt the hum within his chest, a vibration, faint but persistent, as if the machine had marked him. When, at last, he reached the shaft and climbed back to the surface, the light of the jungle seemed harsh, almost unreal. The air was warm and wet, buzzing with insects and alive with the cries of birds. Yet, for Eli, the world above had been forever altered. He had walked among the dead, seen the heart of the secret buried beneath his land, and though he tried to breathe deeply, each inhalation tasted of rust and ashes. When he returned to the village that evening, he avoided the curious glances of his neighbors. His wife asked why he looked so pale, why his hands trembled as he reached for water, but he offered no explanation. How could he tell her? What words could describe the bones chained to walls, the jars of flesh suspended in cloudy liquid, the cold monument of metal that seemed to breathe with a life of its own? He muttered that he had been working too hard, that the digging had exhausted him, and she accepted his answer, though her eyes lingered on him with worry. That night, when he lay beside her, sleep refused to come. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw the bell rising before him, its scarred surface gleaming with faint patterns of light, its silent hum growing louder until it filled the darkness behind his eyelids. Days passed, and Eli tried to carry on with the simple work of survival, gathering wood, tending what little crops remained, repairing a broken roof beam for his neighbor. But the jungle no longer felt the same. At night, he heard sounds drifting from the direction of the pit, faint echoes like a distant chime, or the dull vibration of something vast and buried deep. He told himself it was only the wind pushing through the trees, but the excuse did little to ease the tightness in his chest. The animals of the forest seemed restless too. Dogs in the village barked at shadows, monkeys shrieked from the canopy at dusk, and once Eli swore he saw birds scatter in unison from the trees above the pit as though fleeing some invisible threat. Word began to spread among the villagers that the jungle had grown uneasy. Hunters whispered of lights flickering between the trees at night, pale glows that vanished when approached. A farmer spoke of hearing voices in the undergrowth though he had been alone, voices speaking in a language he did not recognize. Some claimed it was the spirits of the ancestors, others muttered of curses and forbidden places. Eli said nothing, but the whispers coiled around him like smoke, for he knew the truth. He had awakened something that should have remained silent. His torment grew worse when he returned to the pit to cover it more thoroughly, hoping to erase the path that led below. Yet, when he stood above the metal hatch, he swore he could feel warmth radiating faintly through the soil. His hands shook as he spread branches and dirt to hide it, though he knew the jungle could never truly conceal what had been revealed. When he turned to leave, he thought he heard the faintest sound rise from beneath his feet, a low thrum, steady as a heartbeat. It followed him all the way back to the village, echoing in his ears, though no one else seemed to hear it. At home, his children tugged at his arms, asking him to tell them stories as he once had. He tried, but the words faltered, the tales of heroes and spirits ringing hollow now that he carried the knowledge of real horrors beneath the earth. He saw the faces of the skeletal prisoners in every pause, heard the cries of the forgotten dead in every silence. His wife watched him with growing unease, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder as though she feared he might vanish before her eyes. He wanted to confide in her, to share the truth, but the thought of the bell spreading beyond his own mind filled him with dread. If she knew, she might tell others, and soon outsiders would come. Soldiers, scientists, treasure hunters, the world above would descend like vultures upon the jungle, tearing it apart in search of what should never be found. The conflict gnawed at him. He had always believed that truth was better than silence, that remembering was better than forgetting. His grandfather's stories had been a gift, a way of ensuring the past was not erased. But this truth was different. It was poison. If the world learned of the bell, they would not see it as a warning. They would see it as a prize. He could imagine men in suits arriving with machines, digging deeper, prying open the heart of the chamber until the bell was pulled into daylight. He could imagine the hum swelling louder, the patterns on its surface glowing once more, the terrible secrets of the past bleeding into the present. And he could not allow that. Yet silence was no easier. Each night he lay awake, the hum reverberating through his bones, louder now, no longer just a memory but a constant presence. At times he thought he saw the lantern light flicker, though no flame burned, or shadows shift in the corners of his home, though no one stood there. Once, walking alone near the edge of the forest, he thought he saw a figure in the trees, a man in a dark uniform with pale eyes staring back at him. When he blinked, the vision was gone, but the fear remained. Was it a ghost of those who had died, or a trick of his imagination? He did not know. All he knew was that the bell had tied itself to him, that it was awake again in some small way, and he was its witness, perhaps even its keeper. The villagers' whispers grew louder. Some spoke of cursed ground, others of treasures hidden by foreign soldiers long ago. A group of young men even suggested searching the jungle to find what was causing the disturbances, their voices filled with bravado. Eli's heart froze when he heard them. If they stumbled upon the hatch, if they descended into the tunnels, they would see what he had seen. And worse, they might touch the bell, stir it fully awake. He wanted to cry out, to beg them to stay away, but to protest too much would draw suspicion. He was trapped in silence, forced to watch as curiosity crept closer to doom. One night, unable to bear it any longer, he rose from his bed and walked into the jungle alone. The moon hung low, casting silver through the canopy, and the air was thick with the sounds of insects. He carried no lantern this time, only the memory of the path. When he reached the pit, he stood over the hidden hatch and listened. The hum was louder now, faint but steady, pulsing beneath the soil. He dropped to his knees, pressing his ear against the ground, and for a moment he thought he heard voices within the vibration. Whispers in the harsh tongue his grandfather had described, rising and falling like a chant. He staggered back, his chest tight with terror. In that moment, Eli understood the truth. The bell had never been buried to be forgotten. It had been buried alive, its creators perhaps fleeing or dying before they could finish their work. The tunnels, the corpses, the rubble sealing bodies into walls, none of it had silenced the machine. It had merely been waiting, slumbering in darkness, feeding on the memories of the dead. And now, because of him, it stirred again. He sank to the ground, hands trembling, torn between two paths. He could leave it sealed, hoping the jungle would once more swallow the truth, though he doubted it could now that the vibrations spread beyond the walls of the chamber. Or he could bring others, scholars and governments, to witness it, though doing so might doom the world to repeat the mistakes of the past. Either choice felt like betrayal, of his people, of the dead, of his children's future. His heart ached with the weight of it, and for the first time in years he wept openly, his tears vanishing into the soil that hid the cursed discovery. When he rose at last, the dawn was beginning to pale the sky. He turned his back on the pit and walked slowly home, the hum echoing behind him with every step. The bell remained in the heart of the jungle, alive and waiting, and Eli knew that whatever choice he made, its shadow would follow him until the end of his days. The sleepless nights had drained him, but Eli knew he could not delay any longer. The bell haunted his every waking thought, and its hum reverberated through his bones with a persistence that would not let him rest. He had tried to cover the truth with branches and soil, had tried to bury his fear in silence, but secrets of that weight are never still. They press outward, seeping into dreams, into whispers carried by the wind, until silence itself becomes a form of betrayal. The jungle was restless, the villagers suspicious, and deep in his heart, Eli understood that he had been drawn into something far larger than himself. It was no longer only his burden. It was his choice whether to condemn others by speaking or by remaining quiet. But either way, the shadow of what he had uncovered would outlast him. The morning he chose to return to the tunnels was eerily calm. The air was heavy, the sky muted gray, and the birds that usually shrieked in the canopy seemed to have gone silent, as if they too knew what awaited. He gathered what little strength he had left, took his lantern and spade, and walked towards the pit that had become the axis of his life. His wife watched him go from the doorway, her face drawn with concern, but he offered no words of comfort. There were none to give. He could not confess where he was going, and he could not promise he would return. The path felt longer than before, though his feet knew every bend and root. When he reached the concealed hatch, he stood still for a long time, listening. The hum was stronger than ever, vibrating faintly in the soil, pulsing like a heartbeat beneath the earth. He touched the ground with his palm, and for a moment he thought he felt warmth radiating through it, as though the machine below had awakened fully. His mouth went dry. To open the hatch again might be to invite disaster, yet to leave it was to abandon the dead and to surrender the future to chance. He had not sought this discovery, but it had chosen him all the same, and now it demanded a decision. With trembling hands, he pulled away the branches and earth, pried the hatch open, and descended once more into the shaft. The metal rungs were slick with condensation, the air colder with every step down. When his feet touched the concrete floor of the tunnel, the silence seemed absolute. His lantern illuminated the same walls he had walked before, but they felt closer now, as if the darkness pressed inward, reluctant to let him pass. He moved slowly, each footfall echoing, the hum growing stronger the deeper he went, until it no longer seemed to come from the walls, but from inside his own chest. The chamber of the bell awaited him, vast and silent, its air charged with a strange energy. The machine loomed in the center, its surface dull yet gleaming faintly in the lantern light. He stared at it for a long time, his breath uneven, his body heavy with dread. The patterns etched into its surface seemed to shift again, curling and twisting when he looked too closely, and his lantern flickered in response. He remembered the bodies walled into stone, the bones scattered in the tunnels, the jars filled with fragments of lives stolen. Every death, every agony, had been swallowed into the shadow of this machine. The dead cried out through him, demanding that the truth be acknowledged, demanding that the cycle of silence be broken. Eli set the lantern on the floor and knelt, bowing his head. He spoke softly, words that rose from deep inside him, not rehearsed but born of grief and fury. He spoke to his grandfather, to the prisoners, to all those whose voices had been taken. He promised he would not let them be forgotten, that their suffering would not vanish into darkness. Yet, as he spoke, his voice cracked with doubt. Was remembrance enough? Could it ever balance the horror that stood before him? The bell was not only memory, it was a threat. Left alone, it might one day awaken fully, whether by accident or by the hands of those who still hungered for power. And if it did, the world above would tremble. He rose slowly, his resolve hardening. His choices narrowed before him like the walls of the tunnel. He could leave the bell sealed, pray the jungle would keep it hidden forever, but the hum told him otherwise. It was alive, it was patient, and patience meant danger. He could reveal it to the world, bring officials, scientists, men who would descend upon the tunnels with greed in their eyes. That, too, would unleash its shadow. Or he could destroy it, end it once and for all, bury the past beneath rubble and fire, even if it meant his own death. He studied the chamber carefully, his lantern's glow flickering across the walls. The rubble that entombed the bodies had collapsed from above, proof that the stone and steel could be broken. If he could bring down enough of the ceiling, the machine might be buried beyond recovery, crushed under tons of earth. His spade alone would never suffice, but he had seen old fuel drums in one of the side rooms, rusted but perhaps still potent. With fire and collapse, perhaps he could finish what the war itself had failed to do. Perhaps he could silence the bell forever. The thought filled him with both terror and peace. To destroy it would mean closing the circle, giving rest to the dead, ensuring his children and their children would never live under its shadow. but it would also mean sacrifice. He doubted he could escape the collapse in time. He would become one more skeleton in the tunnels, one more whisper among the echoes. Yet, as he imagined his children's faces, their laughter free of the burden he now carried, he felt the faint stirrings of acceptance. His life was his to give, but their future was not his to gamble. He gathered what he needed with steady hands, though each step felt like farewell. He found the drums, heavy with the stench of fuel even after decades, and rolled them into the chamber. He wedged his lantern among the debris, arranging the wood and rusted metal to serve as kindling. His hands worked without hesitation, though his heart pounded with each movement. When, at last, the preparations were complete, he stood before the bell one final time. Its surface seemed almost to shimmer in the lantern's glow, as though aware of what he intended. The hum coursed through him, louder now, filling his ears, urging him to stop. He pressed his hands to his ears, but the vibration only grew stronger, beating against his skull like a drum. He shouted then, a cry that echoed through the vast chamber, his voice raw with fury and grief. He cursed the men who had built this machine, cursed the cruelty that had fed it, cursed the silence that had allowed it to sleep undisturbed. His words were swallowed by the darkness, but in his heart he knew the dead had heard. He whispered goodbye to his family, to the village, to the land he loved, and then struck the lantern to the ground. The flame caught instantly, racing along the spilled fuel with a hiss. Fire blossomed, consuming the debris, licking at the drums until they roared with heat. The chamber filled with light and smoke, the shadows writhing across the walls. Eli stepped back, his eyes fixed on the bell as the fire spread. As the ceiling above began to groan, the machine stood unmoving, its surface gleaming with reflections of the flames, but the hum continued, steady, unyielding, as though mocking his attempt. He prayed that the collapse would be enough, that the jungle would reclaim what men had built, and then the roar of falling stone drowned out everything. Above, the villagers stirred at the sound, a distant rumble like thunder rising from the earth. Birds erupted from the canopy, filling the sky in a frenzy of wings. The ground trembled, then stilled. When silence returned, it was deep and complete, as though the jungle itself had exhaled. In the village, Eli's wife waited at the doorway, her eyes scanning the path that led into the trees. She waited until the sun had set, and she waited as the stars appeared, but he did not return. Only the jungle returned to stillness, its secrets once more buried beneath layers of earth and time. Far below, in the darkness of the collapsed chamber, the bell lay entombed beneath rubble, its surface cracked and silent. The hum was gone, or perhaps only muffled, waiting once more. The shadow of the past had claimed Eli, but in his sacrifice he had given voice to the dead and a chance at freedom to the living. The jungle closed in again, roots and vines creeping over the scar of the collapse, the earth knitting itself shut. Yet the memory of the discovery lingered, carried in whispers and in dreams. For those who listened closely, the silence was not quite complete, as if somewhere deep in the heart of the jungle, the past still waited, patient and watchful. If you were shocked by what you just heard, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next unbelievable story. Trust me, what's coming will leave you speechless. Check out our other videos right now for even more hidden truths and forgotten secrets. And don't keep this to yourself. Share this video with your friends and family because everyone needs to know what was buried in the shadows of history.